12. Today the emperor, although no better than he had been for some days past, determined, as he said, to nurse himself no longer. He dressed and repaired to the drawing room, where he dictated for 2 or 3 hours to one of his suite. He had eaten nothing for 3 days. He had not yet been relieved by the crisis, which he expected, and which is usually produced by the singular regimen which he prescribed to himself. He continued drinking warm lemonade. This circumstance led him to inquire how long a person might live without eating, and how far drink might supply the place of solid food. He sent for the Encyclopedia Britannica, in which he met with some very curious facts. For instance, he found that a woman had existed for 50 days without solid food and drinking only twice. Another instance was mentioned of a person who had lived 20 days upon water alone. Somebody observed in reference to this subject that Charles VII, out of pure contradiction to the opinions of the individuals who were round him, had abstained from eating for the space of 5 or 6 days, at the expiration of which, however, he devoured a turkey and a leg of mutton at the hazard of bursting. Napoleon laughed at this anecdote and assured us that he felt no wish to run to such extremes, however attractive the model might be in other respects. The emperor played a game at piquet with Madame de Monttalon, the Grand Marshal, having entered. He left off playing and asked him how he thought he looked. Bertrand replied, "Only rather yellow," which was indeed the case. The emperor rose good-humoredly and pursued Bertrand into the saloon in order to catch him by the ear, exclaiming, "Rather yellow indeed! Do you intend to insult me, Grand Marshal? Do you mean to say that I am bilious, morose, atrabiliarious, passionate, unjust, tyrannical? Let me catch hold of your ear. I will take my revenge." The dinner hour arrived, and the emperor for some time was undecided whether he would sit down at table with us or dine alone in his room. He decided upon the latter plan, lest, as he said, he should be tempted to imitate Charles II if he sat at the great table, but he would have found it difficult to do that. He returned while we were at dinner, and from the scanty way in which our table was served, he said he really pitied us, for in fact we had scarcely anything to eat. This circumstance induced the emperor to resort to a painful extremity. He instantly gave orders that a portion of his plate should be sold every month to supply what was necessary for our table. The worst thing connected with our wretched dinner was the wine, which had for some days been execrable and had made us all unwell. We were obliged to send for some to the camp in the hope that which had been furnished to us would be changed, as we could not drink it. In course of a conversation which took place respecting the wine, the emperor stated that he had received a great number of instructions and directions from chemists and physicians, all of whom had concurred in declaring that wine and coffee were the two things respecting which it was most necessary he should be on his guard. Every professional man had cautioned him to reject both wine and coffee if he experienced any unpleasant flavor in them. Wine in particular he was advised to abstain from if he found anything uncommon in the taste of it. He had always been in the habit of getting his wine from Chambertin, and had therefore seldom occasion to find fault with it. But the case is different now. If he had refused wine whenever he found anything uncommon in it, he must have abstained from it for a considerable time past. The 13th, the weather's very bad, and it has continued so for 3 weeks or a month. The emperor sent for me before 1 o'clock. He was in his saloon. Our amphitryon had paid me a visit, and I took him to the emperor, who spoke to him on matters of a personal and private nature. Napoleon is much altered in his looks. Today he wished to set to work. I sent for my son, and he went over the chapters relating to the Pope and Tagliamento. He continued thus employed until 5 o'clock. He was very low-spirited and appeared to be suffering much. He retired, saying he would try to eat a little. 2 ships came within sight. One was supposed to be the Eurydice, which was every moment expected to arrive from Europe. Having touched at the Cape, they proved to be, however, one of the company's ships and another vessel that was accidentally passing the island. The emperor came to us while we were at dinner. He said he had eaten enough for 4 persons, and that this had quite restored him. He wanted something to read and looked over his brother Lucien's poem of Charlemagne. He analyzed the first canto and afterwards glanced over a few others. He then examined the subject and the plan of the work. How much labor, ingenuity, and time, he observed, had been thrown away upon this book. What a wreck of judgment and taste. Here are 20,000 verses, some of which may be good for aught I know, but they are destitute of interest, design, or effect. It might have been regarded as a compulsory task had it been written by a professed author. Why did not Lucien, with all his good sense, consider that Voltaire, master as he was of the French language and the art of poetry, failed in a similar attempt? Though that attempt was made in Paris in the midst of the sanctuary. How could Lucien suppose it was possible to write a French poem when living at a distance from the French capital? How could he pretend to introduce a new meter? He has written a history in verse and not an epic poem. An epic poem should not be the history of a man, but of a passion or an event. And then, what a subject has Lucien chosen? What barbarous names has he introduced? Does he think he has succeeded in raising up the religion which he conceived to be fallen? Is his poem intended as a work of reaction? It certainly bears the stamp of the soil on which it was written. It's full of prayers, priests, the temporal authority of the popes. How could he think of devoting 20,000 lines to absurdities which do not belong to the present age, to prejudices which he could not enter into, and opinions which he could not entertain? What a misapplication of talent! He might undoubtedly have produced something more creditable to himself, for he possesses judgment, facility, and industry. He was in Rome amidst the richest materials and with the means of satisfying the deepest research. He understands the Italian language, and as we have no good history of Italy, he might have written one. His talent, his situation, his knowledge of affairs, his rank might have enabled him to produce an excellent classic work. It would have been a valuable acquisition to the literary world and would have conferred honor on its author. But what is Charlemagne? What reputation will it gain? It will be buried in the dusty libraries, and its author will obtain at most a few scanty, perhaps ridiculous notices in biographical dictionaries. If Lucien cannot resist the temptation of scribbling verses, he should have prepared a splendid manuscript embellished with elegant designs and superb binding, with which he might now and then have gratified the eyes of the ladies, occasionally allowing a few quotations from it to creep into publicity. And finally, he should have left it to his heirs with severe prohibition against submitting it to the press. One might then have been able to understand his taste. He laid the work aside and said, "Let us turn to the Iliad." My son went to fetch it, and the emperor read a few cantos, stopping at various passages in order, as he said, to admire them at his ease. His observations were copious and remarkable. He was so deeply interested in what he read that it was 12:30 before he retired to rest. The 14th. The terrible state of the weather still continued and confined us to our miserable huts. We are all indisposed. The emperor dictated during a part of the day, and he felt himself much better. At dinner, we had literally scarcely anything to eat. The governor continued his successive reductions. The emperor ordered some additional provisions to be purchased and paid for out of the produce of the sale of his plate. The governor intimated that the allowance of wine should continue fixed at 1 bottle for each individual, the emperor included. Will it be credited? 1 bottle for a mother and her children. These were the words used in the note. The emperor retired to his own apartment and sent for me to attend him. "I am not inclined to sleep," said he, "and I sent for you to help to keep me on my vigil." Let us have a little chat together. The turn of the conversation led us to speak of the island of Elba, of the emperor's occupations, sensations, and opinions while he continued there. Finally, his return to France and the brilliant success which attended him, and which he said he never for a moment doubted. Many observations were repeated, which I have already noted down at different times. At one moment he said, "They may explain this as they will, but I assure you, I never entertained any direct or personal hatred of those whose power I subverted. To me, it was merely a political contest. I was astonished myself to find my heart free of animosity, and I may add, animated by goodwill towards my enemies. You saw how I released the Duc d'Angoulême, and I would have done the same by the king, and even have granted him an asylum of his own choosing. The triumph of the cause in no way depended on his person, and I respected his age and his misfortunes. Perhaps also I felt grateful for a certain degree of consideration which he in particular had observed towards me. It is true that at the moment to which I am now alluding, he said, I believe, outlawed me and set a price upon my head, but I looked upon all this as belonging to the manifesto style. The same kind of denunciations were also issued by the Austrian government, without, however, giving me much uneasiness, though I must confess that my dear father-in-law was rather too severe on the husband of his beloved daughter. Since I have once more had occasion to mention the emperor's return from the island of Elba, this is perhaps the proper place to fulfill their promise I made in volumes 1 and 2 of giving a narrative of the circumstances connected with that extraordinary event. Should the reader inquire the cause of this transposition, I reply that I considered the subject in itself as very delicate, and I had not in the early part of my journal given those proofs of its real spirit which were necessary to banish every suspicion of my being actuated by malevolent motives. Now, however, everyone must be convinced that my statements are purely philosophic, moral, and historical, and that therefore the task of correcting or refuting any errors they contain must be consigned to the historian and the critic. The account of Napoleon's return from Elba is contained in the journals and publications of every country. My narrative, therefore, cannot be expected to present much novelty, except that it was collected from the mouth of Napoleon. I here combine together the statements that fell from him at different times. Napoleon was residing at the island of Elba on the faith of treaties when he learned that at the Congress of Vienna some idea was entertained of transporting him from Europe. None of the articles of the Treaty of Fontainebleau were fulfilled. The public papers informed him of the state of feeling in France, and he accordingly formed his determination. He kept the secret until the last moment, and under one pretense or another means were found for making the requisite preparations. It was not until they were all on board that the troops first conceived a suspicion of the emperor's purpose. 1,000 or 1,200 men had set sail to regain possession of an empire containing a population of 30 millions. There were nearly 500 or 600 men on board the brig in which Napoleon embarked. This was as many as the crew of 74. They fell in with a French brig of war, with which they spoke. It was asserted that the captain of the French brig recognized them, and at parting exclaimed 3 times, "A good voyage to you." At all events, the officer who commanded the emperor's vessel proposed to pursue and capture the brig. The emperor rejected the idea as absurd. Such a proceeding could only have been excusable had necessity demanded it. Why, said he, should I introduce this new incident to my plan? What advantage should I derive from its success? To what risks would its failure expose me? After the check they experienced on landing by the capture, 20 men who had been sent to summon Antibes, a variety of opinions was advanced and urged with some warmth. Some proposed that they should make immediately an attack and carry Antibes in order to obviate the evil consequences which might ensue from the resistance of that place and the imprisonment of the 20 men. The emperor replied that the taking of Antibes would be no step towards the conquest of France, that during the brief interval that would be occupied in the execution of that project, a general alarm would be raised throughout the country, and that obstacles would be opposed to them, and the only course which it was expedient they should pursue. He added that time was valuable, and that the ill consequences of the affair of Antibes might be effectually obviated by marching towards with sufficient speed to anticipate the news. An officer of the guard indirectly hinted that it was not right thus to abandon the 20 men who had been made prisoners, but the emperor merely observed that he had formed a poor idea of the magnitude of the enterprise, that if half of his followers were in the same situation, he would not scruple to abandon them in the same manner, and that if they were all made prisoners, he would march forward alone. A few hours before nightfall, he landed at the Gulf of Juan, where he bivouacked. Soon after, postilion in splendid livery was conducted to him. It turned out that this man had formerly been in the imperial household. He had been a domestic of the Empress Josephine, and was now in the service of the Prince of Monaco, who himself had been equerry to the Empress. The postilion, on being questioned by the Emperor, informed him, after expressing his great astonishment at finding him there, that he had just come from Paris, and that he was sure he would everywhere be joyfully greeted. He affirmed that all along the road, as far as Avignon, he had heard nothing but regret for the emperor's absence, that his name was publicly echoed from mouth to mouth, and that when once fairly through Provence, he would find the whole population ready to rally around him. The man added that his splendid livery had frequently rendered him the object of odium and insult. This was the testimony of one of the common class of society. It was very gratifying to the emperor, and entirely corresponded with his expectations. The Prince of Monaco himself, on being presented to Napoleon, was less explicit. Napoleon refrained from questioning him on political matters. There were persons present, and he did not wish to incur the risk of eliciting any detail which might create unfavorable impressions on those about him. The conversation therefore assumed a lively character, and turned entirely on the ladies of the imperial court of the Tuileries, of whom Napoleon made the minutest inquiries. As soon as the moon had risen, which was about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, the bivouac broke up, and Napoleon gave orders for proceeding to Grasse. There he expected to find a road which he had planned out during the Empire. However, the design had not been executed, and he was reduced to the necessity of passing through narrow defiles filled with snow. He therefore left behind him, in the charge of the municipality of Grasse, his carriage and 2 pieces of cannon, which had been brought ashore. This was termed a capture in the bulletins of the time. The municipality of Grasse was devoted to the royalist party, but the sudden appearance of the emperor afforded but little time for hesitation, and they came to render their submission to him. The emperor, having passed through the town, halted on a little height at some distance beyond it, where he breakfasted. He was soon surrounded by the whole population of the town, and he treated the multitude as though he had been in the midst of his court circle to Tuileries. He heard the same sentiments and the same prayers as before he quitted France. One complained of not having received his pension. Another solicited an addition to his allowance. A third presented that his cross of the Legion of Honor had been withheld from him. A fourth prayed for promotion. A number of petitions had already been drawn up and were presented to him, just as though he had come from Paris and was making a tour through the departments. Some enthusiastic patriots who were well acquainted with the state of affairs secretly informed Napoleon that the authorities of the place were very hostile to him, but that the mass of the people were devoted to him, and that they only waited until his back should be turned in order to rid themselves of the miscreants. "Be not too hasty," said the emperor. "Let them have the mortification of seeing our triumph without having anything to reproach us with. Be tranquil and prudent.